Welcome everyone to this webinar where we launch the report Women on the Move, Trafficking, Sex Work and Reproductive Health among West African migrant women. My name is Marie Barse and I'm a journalist and communications officer here at DIIS, and I will try to get us safely through this webinar and moderate today's topic. We have 4 speakers in our program today who will share their different perspectives on women's migration. Senior researcher Signe Plambæk will start with a general introduction to the report, and then we have our PhD student Akhlem Shemlali, who will talk about her research and fieldwork among migrant women in Tunisia, a country which some of the women actually describe as living in an open prison. After Akhlem, Maria Chiara Cherio, who used to be an intern here at DIIS and part of the research project behind this report, she'll tell you about her fieldwork in Italy, where she interviewed pregnant irregular migrants from West Africa. And last, we'll hear from Merete Egel, who has been a nurse with Doctors Without Borders for 22 years and who is specialized in reproductive health and sexual violence among migrants and refugees, and also people in poorer countries. And she'll share some perspectives on women fleeing the war in Ukraine. After we heard from our speakers, we'll take questions from you. We have this Q&A function in the bottom, so you can just use that and post your questions and just post them as we go along. And if you have a question for a specific speaker, it would be super if you could just write the name of, if you want Signe to answer or Akhlem. And I will make sure that the researchers answer as many questions as possible after the different talks. But again, welcome, and great to, I can't see any of you, but great to be here with all of you. And I will now let Signe Plambæk take over, and she will introduce today's topic and present some of the most important insights that she and her colleagues gained through the work with this report.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you so much for this introduction. We have been looking so much forward to this day. I think launching reports after COVID is special to most researchers. This has been a process that's taken much longer than we anticipated because we were not able to do the fieldwork that we wanted. So we have been excited to share some of the results today. And thank you for so many of you to join us on such a sunny day, for those of you who are in Copenhagen. But I can see we have a very international audience, so I hope you will join the discussion later. This project was initiated, as I said, several years ago, and I just want to tell you a little bit about the background before I turn to some of our methods and findings and more overall insights. So I initially wanted to look at, after doing research for many years on Nigeria, on what women's migration also from Southeast Asia, what we could see, many of us doing research on this and many reports and statistics, was that despite women migrants knowing that it's risky to migrate undocumented, they continue to do so. At the time when we initiated the project, there was an increase of, in particular, Nigerian women crossing the Mediterranean Sea, an increase by over 600%. And so and at the same time, there was billboards across the areas in Nigeria where the women moved from, but also in other West African countries, these information campaigns warning in particular women of the risk of trafficking and death had been there for many years, but we still saw this increase. So I was very thankful when I was in dialogue with Open Society Foundations, who are those who have funded our report and our work, that they were interested in us doing research that more looked into conveying not the usual do not migrate message, but more a harm reduction and safe migration message, or looking into what harm reduction and safe migration might mean. And let me just clarify what we mean here, because when we talk about the do not migrate message, it has often been conveyed as protecting women from trafficking and death on the way. But the women, when interviewed on this, often experience it as a do not migrate, but then they were not offered any opportunities, livelihood opportunities, to make them stay at home, so to speak. So we saw them migrating anyway, and with this project we were then able to look into kind of acknowledging the agency in women's migration, that they're doing it anyway. So how can we then protect them better? How can humanitarian organizations provide assistance that are better targeted at women? So that was kind of the point of departure. So this harm reduction in basically reducing the harm that we knew that many women were going through. In that connection, I just want to thank in particular Sebastian Kohn from Open Society in New York. And because we were doing this during COVID, I also want to make sure that we thank Professor Ikputu and Professor Araisa in Tunisia, who, because COVID was making it difficult for us to do this research, it also opened up wonderful opportunities to collaborate with colleagues in countries that we didn't initially had these kind of research collaborations with. I'm very thankful for that, and I can see that some of you are part of the audience today. And here is the report. And I can only recommend you to download it. You can also get a printed version. What we are very happy about with it is that there's a lot of photos in it that shows the everyday life from the field. There are also photos that the women took themselves from their own lives. Let me just find one of them. So these are like everyday photos from motherhood and childcare in Sicily, but also photos that some of the women took with instant cameras in Nigeria. So I can really recommend you to look into it. And if I can just have Emilie show the first map. I hope you're all able to see the map on your screen now. I just wanted to tell you where it is that we have been doing fieldwork. So we have been in Nigeria, primarily in Benin City. And here we interviewed women who were planning to go to Europe, but also women who had returned from Libya and from Europe during via IOM anti-trafficking programs, or in other ways had been deported or returned to Nigeria. Then Ahlam did fieldwork in Tunisia, where she interviewed quite a lot of women from the Ivory Coast. But in overall, we have interviewed 51 migrant women. So it's not a large scale project. It's more a question of us wanting to really speak in depth with this group of women across West Africa. And also, you can see that the route that we have kind of wanted to look more into is the route across Niger to Libya. In recent years, more women are crossing from Tunisia. Ahlam will talk more about that. And then across to Sicily, where both I and Maria have done field work. And then we also ended up doing some research in Copenhagen, because several of the women, in particular the Nigerian women, are traveling all the way from Nigeria, waiting in transit, going to Italy, and then moving onwards to Copenhagen. That is not something new, that has happened for many, many years. But we wanted to kind of not only pay attention to a country of origin and country of destination, but in particular to what happens with women in transit. And Ahlam will talk more about that. As I said, 51 women, whereof about half of them were involved in sex work, but we will also talk a bit more about what that might mean. Could I get the next map, please? Or the next slide? As you can see, actually the number of women arriving to now, we are only looking at the Italian shores, have dropped dramatically. So it's not so much a question of us wanting to look into the increase as such, because we don't have an increase right now, but just the continuous issues that have shown that continuously are popping up when we look at research into women's migration. And you can go leave the slides so that people can maybe see me. Yeah, thank you. So the basic kind of question is, and something we have known for many years, is that the more difficult it is to enter Europe, the more risky, the higher the death, and the higher the debt as well, death and debt, the higher the risk the women are taking on the way. But we wanted to ask how that happens and what that means for women in particular. So one of the other ideas we wanted to look into, and one of the main insights, and of course all that is detailed in the report, but we wanted to try to look into how making the invisible more visible. So rather than this continued discussion about women as victims of violence, women as victims of human trafficking, we wanted to look into what are some of the more often mentioned but rarely visible issues that women raise on their journeys. They are often, for instance, pregnancies, abortions, it is debt, often to traffickers and smugglers, but we are able to show that actually debt is a main key driver. Old debt, new debt, debt to other actors than human traffickers is as a very important but often invisible topic. We wanted to show how reproductive health and how reproductive issues often shape women's migration, but are rarely talked about. And then we wanted to look more into motherhood, because when we maybe discuss why look at women's migration, men also suffer when they migrate. Of course they do. They also die tragically, and they struggle on the way. But men and women migrate for different reasons. They also, you can say, suffer in different kind of ways. But one thing that really separates them is the question of mothering on the way. So we wanted to look into that, and are able to kind of show how these things are often interconnected. So you can't just talk about motherhood, sex work, trafficking, and debt in separate kind of domains. We are able in the report to show how all these things together shape women's migration. I would say in particular that that we need to look more into the question of mothering on the way. we need to look more into depth. So these are also some of the main insights. It's also tragic for us to see that all of the women that we interviewed have experienced sexual assaults in different kind of ways, and here again, not only on the hand by the hands of sex clients or traffickers, as is often discussed, but actually every so often from authorities on the way. So these are some of the kind of the main findings, and maybe we should have the third slide. Thank you. So I wanted to show you how we kind of have worked with conceptually with trafficking and labor migration, because as is often talked about, this type of migration where women travel debt bonded and end up in selling sex is often discussed only in terms of trafficking. And we wanted to see if it was possible to develop a more complex model rather than a forced, non-forced, trafficked, not trafficked, free, unfree. It was very clear from our research, as well as from many other researchers, that the women that we interviewed were in this gray zone where they kind of move back and forth on what we have in our report called a trafficking and labor migration continuum. As you can see, in the one side we have trafficked, forced, irregular, unfree, debt bonded migration, and on the other we have labor, voluntary, regular, free, debt free migration. And the women that we talked with considered themselves as traveling for labor, so a kind of labor migrants. And then they were sometimes unsuccessful, they were stuck, they were in transit, they were looking for better opportunities, business opportunities. Rarely did they consider themselves trafficked, but only when they did consider themselves trafficked or others considered them trafficked, they were able to get assistance, which is one of the main dilemmas when they have arrived to Europe, that only when kind of understanding themselves as trafficked and being identified as such, they were able to get assistance. So we just wanted to use this model to show how the women move back and forth on this continuum. And we also try to talk more about what we call endangered sex work migration for those who were involved in sex work, to say that that they were trying to pay off that debt that they incurred while trying to get to Europe. Most of them have stories of debt and trying to find labor in order to repay that debt. So we really wanted to put forward how debt structures the migration journeys. And as both Ahlam and Maria will talk to, there are other things that structure the migration journeys as well. I think I have almost spent my time, haven't I, Marie?
Yeah. You have just 1 minute left, and no, now you don't. But maybe I could just. You already touched a bit upon this, the importance of studying, or you said in the in your presentation why you wanted to study women's migration, because you were interested in, instead of doing research on how can you stop people from migrating, then getting an understanding of when people still migrate, even though they want, how can we maybe reduce the harms or try to make migration more safe. But could you say just shortly a little bit about why it's important to study women's migration?
I think it's important to study women's migration and also men's migration together and separately. The reason why this focus so much on women's migration is because I felt when I initiated the project that there was a need to have this specific focus, because so often I and other researchers met women who talked about abortion, they talk about pregnancies, they talk about the children that they left behind in Nigeria and other countries, they talk about giving birth to babies while they have arrived in Europe. So this question of motherhood, reproductive health, and sexual violence, that we are able to show that all of the women we interviewed had experienced, are so connected to them being to their gender, to being women, and so it was needed to kind of separate and ask directly about that. And that is also, maybe just to wrap up, that in the end of the report we have a set of recommendations for practitioners, politicians and others who work directly with women's with migration and women's issues, and we wanted to ask the women themselves. So the women have a quite strong voice in the report, and we have asked them what would now when you migrate anyway, despite the risk, despite the information campaigns, what would then help you to have a more safe journey. And many of the responses are quite connected to the fact that they are traveling as women, to protect them for sexual harm, to protect them from pregnancies, and other kind of gendered issues. Yeah, of course, it's difficult to tell you all the insights that we have in the report, so please download it and see all the results.
Yeah, I'd recommend that as well. Yeah, so now we've used up all your time, but very interesting to get this sort of broader introduction. Now we will zoom in a bit on one of these transit countries, or a specific country which has become an important place where many women migrating from West Africa, where they are in transit or end up living for years on the way towards Europe, namely Tunisia. And Akhlem Shemlali, you were in Tunisia last year, where you interviewed more than 100 people, you told me, both migrant women and also representatives from UN and the authorities, the Coast Guard, different NGOs who work with migration. And now we'll hear from you, and I'll just ask you, what could you say a little bit more about what kind of life do the women in Tunisia have in this sort of new space of transit?
Yes, just unmuted. Thank you so much, Marie and Signe, for the opening remarks. And I'm really excited for today and for this launch of the report. Just briefly, my research investigates the unintended consequences of EU's migration policies into North Africa with a particular gendered lens, focusing on migrant women's everyday life, how they navigate their strategies while on the move in transit, as many of the women in this report are. And as just mentioned by Marie, I recently came back actually this year from my fieldwork in February, where I was almost 5 months in Tunisia. And parts of that is part of this report. And we often do hear about country of origin or in destination upon arrival in Europe. So focusing on the in-between space, the en route, or the so-called space of transit, and what does that mean? What is that space? And is it a space of transit? I think that is something that this report also looks into, and something that the women often don't feel they are in, and something I will also speak more to. But I think to really understand and to answer that question, Marie, what kind of life these undocumented West African migrant women have, and the findings, I think it's really important first to just understand this Tunisia, this new so-called space of transit. So I'll just briefly mention that Tunisia has historically been a place where people move to, through, and from. And so in recent years, however, the numbers have increased both towards Europe and mainly Italy, but also internally have become more of mixed forms of migration. And this is, of course, combined with the deteriorating situation in neighboring country Libya, where it has become more difficult and dangerous to be. And then also simultaneous, you have had an increase in crackdowns in Libya, or in Algeria and in Morocco on migrants, and especially undocumented migrants with forced deportation. So you have seen more and more people crossing from borders from Algeria into Tunisia, and more from Libya into Tunisia. And this happens intentionally, but also unintentionally, and I will also say more on that later. But of course, this has also placed Tunisia in the heart of EU migration and border politics. So in many ways, Tunisia has developed into this important laboratory in EU politics and externalization, and you have a lot of activities that are tested out at land and at sea, which means that the Tunisian borders have almost been strengthened a lot, especially border control, and sealed off in a way, and it's been becoming more and more difficult and dangerous to leave Tunisia. Simultaneously, and this is one of the key points or problems in Tunisia and for the migrants there, is that Tunisia still lacks migration and asylum legislation. There's no national authority that has been designated to register or assist or integrate refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. And although these structures are not in place, there are still many West African countries like Ivory Coast or Cameroon, particularly the Francophone West African countries, that have these free visa agreements with Tunisia, meaning that there's no entry visa upon arrival. So the majority of the women that I met in Tunisia were Ivorians, and they also the vast majority in the statistics in Tunisia. Because of these agreements, they are flying directly from Abidjan to Tunis. And let me see if I can share a picture. And they are usually, can you see the picture? Yeah, so basically, thanks to these special visa agreements, they enter the country and can stay up to 90 days. However, what happens after these 90 days is that they need to require this certificate, carte de séjour it's called, which is impossible to get, and thus they find themselves in an even more vulnerable and precarious situation, as there is this pénalité, which is like the daily fine that accumulates for each illegal day you are in the country. And this is equivalent to around 80 Tunisian dinars a month, which is around $30 US. And of course, this amount accumulates for each month, and women who have stayed in the country irregularly for 2 to 3 years end up with really big and hefty fines. And this again results in many of the women finding themselves stuck in involuntary immobility, also in the context of a country that's facing very, serious political and economic crisis. You have inflation and food crisis at the moment because of the Ukraine war, and a very serious COVID-19 pandemic that was especially hard hit for the vulnerable population. They are unable to find work. They can't earn a living, make savings. And this is also what was said in the beginning by Sine. The priority or the reason for many of the women to come to Tunisia is to work and to make money that they can send back home for often their children or families. So many of the women are already mothers when they arrive, and they are mothers across borders because they still are taking care or trying to take care of their children back home, which becomes impossible in this situation. So for many of the women that I met there, what their decision was, or their consideration was, that they actually wanted to cross the Mediterranean irregularly because even though the Tunisia was initially a final destination for many of them, because of these structures, the precariousness, this debt to the state that's just growing and growing, and not being able to leave irregularly, for example, to Algeria, or it's too dangerous for them to go back to Libya, they feel like their only alternative or option is to cross the Mediterranean. And I think for one of the women that I met, actually many of them said something similar, is that actually, if I can, that actually the boat from Sfax, for instance, which is one of the main port cities that leave with boats crossing to Italy, that it's cheaper for them to do that than pay the fine and plane ticket back home, as one of them told me. So look, instead of me saving up to pay la pénalité of 3,000 dinars, then on top pay a plane ticket home for 1,500, 2,000 dinars, I can just pay for a Zodiac to take me to Europe. It's cheaper. I know it's dangerous, but life here is no life. And this is all obviously also speaking to the fact that debt is not only owed to traffickers or private or illicit facilitators. It can also just be accumulating during transit at the hands of the state. And several of the Ivorian women interviewed in Tunis also explained that the organized and forced labor scheme that many of them ended up in when they came to Tunisia, which is also something that is discussed a lot currently in Tunisia. Many of the women who arrive end up in these homes, Tunisian homes, where they work 6 to 12 months with often no pay, and afterwards they are set free. And many of the organizations define this, the civil society in Tunisia, as human trafficking. But while the women describe it as prisons or as slavery. And this is also why this term open air prison, or feeling that they live in an open air prison, was something that many of the women interviewed mentioned. And this also speaks to that the situation where they can't regularize their status, they can't get a work permit, there is no legal framework to help them, and many end up owing so much money to the states that they can't even leave or go back. So they feel trapped, and often the only escape many of them can envision is that to leave irregularly, to cross the Mediterranean. So what happens is that the everyday life becomes, lived in the fringes of society, in shadow communities and shadow economies, where with very limited access to basic services, and especially access to healthcare services and reproductive services. And this is where the women who were often already mothers with children in the home country, but then also becoming mothers in Tunisia, were often single and also sole caregivers with children that were born in Tunisia, and often not registered. And if you're not registered in Tunisia, you can't get access to daycare or to school education. So therefore, the women again end up in a very peculiar limbo legally, where the children who are growing up in Tunisia can't access the same services. So one of the strategies that the women had made was to together organize these underground daycare situations. This is one of them pictured here, where they basically just together take care of each other's children so that they can work on shifts, and the work that they can find is very often informal. It could be street vendors or working in salons. And then the same goes for access to healthcare or medical care. Is also often something that goes into the networks that they already are in. For instance, with abortions, they also use herbal mixtures that they drink to induce an abortion. And although it is impossible in Tunisia to get an abortion at a clinic or hospital, it is very expensive, and many of the women who are undocumented fear the risk of being arrested or deported or registered, just to also be forced to pay the debt which they can't. And so this, of course, also points to the whole situation of mistrust and fear of authorities. So this is, find the picture here. So this dynamic that I explained is only one side of a very multifaceted picture. In Tunisia, it's mainly, again, the women who arrive by plane, which is also very interesting, to Tunis, and they often already have organized some sort of work that then often ends up in these indentured or forced labor schemes. However, there's also a different group or dynamic, which is in the south of Tunisia, mainly in Zarzis and in Medellin, which are bordering Libya, the bordering governorate to Libya. And here the women come from Libya. They have already crossed Sahara and many borders to get there. They often come from Nigeria or other Sierra Leone, typically also Anglophone countries. And they end up in Libya in detention centers where torture and abuse and rape are systematic. So upon entering Tunisia, it is typically because they have escaped Libya and then crossed the border from Libya into Tunisia, crossed the desert there, or they have left Libya by boats and then been intercepted in Tunisian territory by the Tunisian Coast Guard, which have brought them to Tunisia. So you can say, in a sense, many of them and many of the women I met in the south had not chosen Tunisia, or it had not been in any of their plans that Tunisia was a place that they would arrive to. Additionally, many of them were, as mentioned, Anglophone. So arriving in Tunisia, where they speak Arabic and French, was really another thing that marginalized the women even more. And also, speaking to this, they were referred to as the rescued or rescapés, because many of them were taken in by the Coast Guard, which the Tunisian Coast Guard, which is also a new EU collaboration with Tunisia, which is basically maritime border control to rescue these women. And this is also something interesting to look at, if they are rescued or not. But they are returned to Tunisia, where many of them feel that they are just stuck again in a new country and are trying to find a way to leave again. So, and this again speaks to how life in transit, or this movement from A to B, is far from linear. In many cases for these women, it's circular, because some of them are actually considering going back to Libya to try and cross again, and are funneled back in that way. So this is, for instance, the picture here is Mariam that I met there in Medellin. She's from Sierra Leone, and she was in Libya, where she, as you can see here, she was pregnant. She just texted me some days ago. She has a baby now, baby girl who's 3 months old, born in Tunisia. But she's one of the rescued women by the Tunisian Coast Guard who left Libya and are stuck right now in Tunis, or in Medellin, Tunisia. And she's looking into how she can leave again, but how can she do that with a small baby? And she's currently living in a shelter with other women who have also experienced these things in Libya. So basically, I think I'm running out of time, Marie, but
yeah, I think you should start.
I'm summing up. So again, although very different dynamics from the south and the north of Tunisia, a common denominator was also that they were very precarious situations for the women, and they have all, again, witnessed sexual violence. And this involuntary immobility also places the women at increased risk of economic sexual exploitation and abuse, because the woman often also must seek help or assistance from other male migrants or other men in the area, example for accommodation or food. And I think what's also really interesting about these findings and this report is that although, for instance, the majority of the women interviewed in Tunis did not cross desert or borders, they actually flew directly and arrived legally, they still ended up in very irregular and precarious situations because of these structures and restrictive EU policies, as well as these coercive state powers that penalize the undocumented and also limits migrant women, especially, and their children in a state of confinement. So I think I'll just leave it there. And if there are any questions, I can take them later.
Yeah, thank you so much, Achlem. And I think you paint a very, not nice, but I can see, you give us an idea of what kind of life these women live, and I think also an understanding of why they maybe want to leave and why some of them become so desperate that they actually decide to cross the Mediterranean instead of legally going home, because they're unable to legally leave until they pay their debt to the Tunisian state, which is completely crazy when you sit here in Denmark. When you hear about it, it just sounds, yeah, so yeah, strange or crazy in a way. Now I think we should hear from our next speaker, Maria Chiara. You, whereas Achlem, she met some of these women in transit. You met some of the women who actually made it to Italy, maybe by crossing the Mediterranean. And more specifically, you conducted a case study with women who were pregnant. And could you say a little bit about why is that interesting to look into that?
Yeah. Sure. So as Sina and can you hear me? As Sina and Alam said, in our project, we were really interested in looking at the maternity experiences of migrant women, even the really high sexual and gender-based violence that they face, both on their journey from West Africa, but also once they arrived in Italy. And the discussion on the pregnancies of undocumented migrants have been recurring for several years now. In fact, if on one hand we can see how humanitarian organizations try to assist these women while on the move, on the other hand, more political and anti-immigrant debates assume that women got pregnant on purpose to obtain some kind of residency papers and documents. For this reason, as you said, we conducted this case study at Proxima, that is an anti-trafficking center in the southern tip of Sicily. And we wanted to understand how these women live and experience their own maternity experience. In the last years in this anti-trafficking center, 9 pregnant pregnant women have been hosted and assisted, and they either arrived pregnant because they were looking for help, or they became pregnant while they were staying there. In this group, 6 out of 9 women decided to keep the baby. We interviewed the psychologist who followed many of them, and she told us how their marital status highly impacted their decision, so eventually the pregnancy outcome. In fact, for these women, being in stable relationships means that they can actually create a new family in Italy, even if they don't have any certain migration statuses. And this is also means that they used to refuse any contraceptive methods that the practitioners were giving them because they wanted to become mothers. These stories are really similar to Precious' story that you can see in the photo in 1 second. This, yeah, she is Precious, and she's holding her 1-year-old son Ferdinand. I met Precious in an asylum center in Parma, and she told me her story as a migrant and as a mother. She decided to keep Ferdinand only because she was finally in a stable relationship with Joshua, her current partner, because otherwise she said she would never do it alone. In fact, when we were talking, she couldn't hide how traumatized she was while thinking about her journey and her experiences and all the things that she had to go through. In fact, she left Nigeria almost 7 years ago now, and she experienced 3 miscarriages and 1 abortion and many other things that she said she doesn't even want to think or talk about. Yeah, maybe now I can say something more about these abortions.
Yeah, so Precious that we see here, she decided to have Ferdinand and have her baby. But you also talked in your case study, you also have a few women who decided to get an abortion. What kind of considerations were they having regarding deciding to get an abortion instead of getting the baby?
Yeah, so the differences between women in a stable relationship and single women are quite strong. In fact, the last group more often become pregnant after being sexually abused or working in the streets. In our case study, the women who asked for an abortion admitted to the psychologist and gynecologist that they wanted to terminate their pregnancies because they've been sexually abused in Italy. One of them specifically contacted the center only because she wanted to terminate the pregnancy, and then she left the center right after. So in these 3 cases, getting an abortion has been quite easy, as all these migrants have been in the 3 first months of their pregnancies, and they've been assisted by practitioners. But accessing this abortion procedure is not always so smooth. When we talked to the team leader of Red International, which is another anti-trafficking organization based in Copenhagen, she explained how 2 Nigerian women approached the organization after fleeing Italy because they wanted to get abortion, because in Italy they always been denied. They were so determined to terminate their pregnancies that they traveled all the way from Italy to Denmark. And this happens because in the Italian reception system, many aspects of these migrant women's lives, such as their needs, their health, their pregnancies and their abortions, are approached from still a Catholic morality perspective. And for this reason, social worker and medical staff, based on religious grounds, hinder their decisions and are against the choices of abortion, for example. And this example of these 2 Nigerian women, we clearly show how reproductive health can shape the migratory routes and destination of these women. So to wrap up, it's really interesting to see how even if our case and our sample was quite small, our numbers were aligned to the statistics and number of many other studies, and this confirms how reproductive health is a factor that affects almost all the migrant women in similar ways, and yet care services are really easily accessible. In fact, there is this relevant need for mobile clinics along the route in order to provide the information and also birth control methods to migrant women. This aspect of birth control is really, really important, and it needs specific attention from practitioners, NGOs, and humanitarian organizations, because it requires a certain precision and consistency by the women, which of course they can't provide in this chaos of always being on the move and with this constant risk of being deported or arrested while they're migrating.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Maria Chiara. So interesting to also hear about, yeah, the fact that reproductive health and maternity can actually shape the route of migrant women. And now I think we will turn to our last speaker, Merete Engel. We've heard a lot about mostly West African women migrating, but I think the latest example that many of us have seen in the media are women fleeing from the war in Ukraine. So they're not migrating in the same way. They're fleeing a war, which is much closer to a country like Denmark. But still, do you see any similarities or different patterns from the with the women from Ukraine compared to the women in this report?
Yes, thanks a lot, Marie, and thank you for inviting me for this webinar. I'll just share my screen very shortly so that I can show a picture. Do we have the slideshow?
We see it.
That's very good. Thanks a lot. Okay, so thank you for the question. Yes, very much so. I mean, we both see in MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and some similarities, but we also see that there's a big difference. I mean, if we should start with the difference, we have a displaced population due to a war. We have 7 million people displaced in country, and we have more than 6 million people who actually fled across different borders, mainly to Poland. And what we see is that they are welcomed in most countries with open arms. So there is no trafficking or smuggling system as such where you need to pay. You don't need to have money for the journey. And we have a massive humanitarian response to this, and also in terms of all the health needs that we see amongst this displaced population. Also, what we see is that the people, especially women, are fleeing, also have access to those national services, health services that they have in the receiving countries. So that's where this group of women differs from the ones that we see in Africa. But again, when we have a population and societies that are unstable, here it's war, it could be natural disaster, but it could also be women on the move. We do see that the rate of sexual violence, for example, and risk of trafficking is going up. And we also see a big gap in care when it comes to sexual reproductive health services and sexual violence care. And what we've all seen in the media, obviously, is also that women are targeted because there are so many. They are vulnerable when they cross borders. We see that a lot of private persons are trying to help as well, and there's not really a huge coordination system. There is something in place by now, but there is not a huge coordination system when it comes to trying to secure that it's not human traffickers who are trying to pick up women, children, victims amongst this big group of fleeing women. Sorry. We also see that they have to, I'll just turn to the next picture, which is a picture from the metro station in Kharkiv in Ukraine. But it's just an example of the conditions that many displaced and refugee women have to live under. So it's schools, it's sports arenas, it's, as you can see here, the metro stations, hotels, and so on and so on. So here, the refugees and the displaced people are gathered, which, as you can see, in very limited space under bad circumstances, lack of hygiene, lack of support, lack of drinking water, and so on. And when we have a big population like this displaced in a situation like this, we also see that there is a higher rate for example, sexual assaults and rape, because there are difficulties in implementing, for example, safe spaces for women, female areas, good sanitary installations with lights and security, just taking care of who's coming in and out. And we also see that there are some places where women and men are being hosted together. We also see that some has to live privately, and here we also hear stories about women who are trying to be trafficked in that sense. So besides from that, there is a big gap in services, and when in MSF, when we speak about this, we do see that it's really difficult to give a proper access to reproductive health services and sexual violence care. On the next pictures, as you can see here, we don't have a lot of privacy in these places. We don't have access and referral opportunities, because we see that hospitals, for example, are bombed and so on. So whereas there is a lot of attention on the humanitarian assistance, it's quite difficult to actually access the sexual reproductive health services and the sexual violence care as it is right now. We have also seen, and you have all heard those stories as well, in the territories where the Russians have taken over, that we hear about severe sexual violence. Some say it's used as a weapon of war. As MSF, we cannot state that at this current moment, but we know that the 400 to 500 victims that has been identified has been transferred to neighboring countries. So the focus is on, so that's good, but it's still a huge problem. One of the lack of care that we see is, for example, access to safe abortion care, and that is of course because of, for example, the legislation, the restrictive legislation that they have in Poland. But for now, I spoke to our people in Ukraine last week, and they say that they don't have a lot of access to sexual violence victims, because it's really difficult to get the messages out there. We have hotlines, we have shelters, and so on, but there are not many who come forward because they're afraid. It has to be reported to the police. The doctor has to report it to the police if somebody comes and tells about a rape. And it's not only the Russians who are raping, we're also seeing an increase in rape from Ukrainian soldiers, and we also see an increase in what is called intimate partner violence. So at this moment, we're trying to figure out what the best approach will be in terms of identifying and making sure that they have the access that they need, both for reproductive health services, but also for sexual violence care. I'm just stop sharing here.
Yeah, so some important similarities, one might say, with this vulnerability among the women, and this more vulnerable to sexual violence and rape, and need of reproductive health and health services that can help after sexual violence, but also some important differences regarding the way they are sort of received when they arrive in the neighboring countries. So
Yes.
so maybe for hopefully for some of the Ukrainian women that flee the war, it's maybe a shorter period of time that they live in this this life of vulnerability and sexual violence. Unfortunately, we don't have so much time left, but I actually have two questions, but maybe I'll just take one of them and maybe we can discuss it in the Q&A afterwards. But I just know that Doctors Without Borders also work in some of the areas that the women in this report come from, namely in Libya, and you told me that you also work in the detention centers that Achlem talked about, where women are almost held captive and maybe raped on a daily basis. So what kind of help do you provide there?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll share my screen again because I actually brought some pictures from the detention centers in Libya. In MSF, we've been working in Libya for quite some years now, and are trying to do medical services within the detention centers. We've been connected to around 8 of the detention centers in Libya, where we provide health services, but we also do as much as we can in terms of reproductive health and sexual violence care. And like you also state in your report, what we see is that nearly 100% of all the women that we actually see in these contexts, and we're not just talking Libya, we're also talking in Egypt, we're talking in Niger, for example, Nigeria, along the route, almost 100% of the women have been exposed to some kind of sexual assault or sexual violence. What we see in the detention center is a really hopeless cycle of abuse where women are being prostituted forcefully by the guards, for example, and we continuously must give them the preventive treatments. At the moment, we've had to put our efforts on hold because the violence level towards the detainees and towards actually people like us trying to help has increased. So our security is really, really bad. So therefore, we cannot work as systematically as we would like to do. It's really a horrible, horrible situation that we see, and there is so little that we can do. We also work on the Mediterranean. Here's a picture of our boat at the moment, where we've been working continuously for the last 7 years, picking people up from the water. And we work in the centers in Europe, and like I also said, all along the route. And what we see is that the same as the report is stating, and I'm so happy that I received this report because it just, coincides with what we do, is that there is a huge need for support in this medical area.
Thank you so much, Merete. It was very interesting to hear from you as well. And now we actually only have 10 minutes left. So I hope it's okay with all of you if we just jump to the questions from the audience. And we have a few questions. So I think I'll just start from the top. Henrik Nielsen, he asks, if you could elaborate on the gender and power relation between female migrants and male or just authorities, and what branch of government these authorities represent. And I don't know if you could say a bit about that, Achlem, or...
Yeah, I mean, briefly, yeah, from my fieldwork and interviews with the women, many of them mentioned, especially the women who had crossed in from Libya, that the border guards or police authorities, also from the border from Algeria into Tunisia, had harassed them, abused them. So it does also, and I think this is also something that we find in the research, is that abuse along the route is not only, as we often hear, from smugglers or traffickers, it's also from authorities, from police, from border guards. So this is also something, yes, I have met in my recent fieldwork.
And I see Merete nodding also, and I think maybe many of us who are not doing research in this area or working in the areas like your organization, Merete, we can tend to have this a little black and white idea of debt and abuse, that's something being done by the traffickers or the human smugglers, but it's actually completely blurry, because authorities can also, the women can also accumulate debt to the state, and representatives of the authorities can also be the ones using sexual violence, actually.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've also seen in the humanitarian sector that there have only been access to help, to support, if sexual favors are also being given to those administering the humanitarian aid. And I think that's also an important point to state, that is not just authorities or smugglers, but it's actually also, unfortunately, on behalf of my branch, if you can say it like that, also the people who are actually trying to help. But it just goes to show, at least for me in my long experience, that when you have people in vulnerable situations, there will always be people there who will take the advantage of it.
Yeah.
Which is also, if I can just add, one of the reasons why we are in the report trying not to focus so much on, you can say, the binary or the dichotomy between women and the perpetrators, but really trying to talk about this as a gray zone where the women are moving back and forth between different actors and places and situations. Yeah.
And if I can just add, because I know we're not talking about men and boys here, but we do see some of our projects around in conflict zones. 25% of the patients that we treat for sexual violence are actually men and boys. So it's when we talk about conflict rape, it's not just women, I would like to state.
Yeah, good point. I think we will take the next question from Emilie Kronqvist. And I think this should go to you, Signe, because we discussed that also in a podcast we made about the report. She asked, does having a child provide more access to help in transit or destination countries? And are the children registered, and also can it be a strategy for the women to have children, or does it hinder them more? Signe, I think maybe you should.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and one that connects to a lot of political themes as well, because women arriving on the shores of Europe have been, as Maria also pointed to, accused of carrying so-called anchor babies or passport babies, so that they almost use their pregnancy, that they being pregnant in, for instance, Libya or Tunisia, and then crossed while being pregnant, that they did it on purpose, becoming pregnant on purpose to obtain some kind of humanitarian residency or protection. From my own research among the Nigerian women, it's quite clear, but also from our general research into that it's sometimes almost impossible not to be pregnant when you arrive in Europe, because there's so little way to get an abortion, there's so little way to get a birth control, and almost no productive healthcare. As Merete also said, reproductive healthcare is unfortunately very difficult to provide, even though that we know it's so so needed. So no, I would say the women are not using it but it does sometimes help. Let's take, for instance, Italy. Some of the women that I work among, they have obtained residency because of the child being born on Italian soil. So there are different kind of legal frameworks when you arrive. But for instance, in Italy, you can be allowed to stay longer. And so what happens is that the women are in this continuous prolonging their residency connected to the child. So they're not allowed to be there because they are women or migrants, refugees. They are allowed to be there because they are mothers taking care of a child born on Italian soil. So in that way, you can say that it is possible for them to stay longer, but not in a permanent situation. They still have to have a job and fulfill other requirements. But this idea of them using it, I think we should be very attentive to, because it's difficult not to arrive pregnant.
Thank you, Signe. And we have another question from, I probably won't be able to pronounce this name correctly. I'm very sorry about that. Maliamungu Habibutu. Sorry for not pronouncing it correctly, but I still, even though it's difficult, I think it's an interesting question, because your question is what can be done for the women in transit countries which have laws that inhibit accessibility to reproductive health. I think maybe Achlem, maybe you could start by answering this. So what can be done so that they can access reproductive?
I can first say hi, Habib. It's my former colleague in Uganda. But it's a good question because what exactly, this is also one of the reasons it's so difficult for the women, because they end up in this legal limbo where there's not access, they're not registered, you can't just go to a hospital or a clinic. So there is civil society organizations. There's like MSF is actually not present anymore in Tunisia, but Médecins du Monde are there, and they do provide some kind of support. They can, for instance, reimburse hospital bills for instance, if the women go into labor or if they have a C-section. But still, it's very difficult, and also a lot of the women don't know about these services or how to access them. So it's happens very ad hoc, and of course there's also different kinds of migrant women. Some are more resourceful than others, so they can also through their networks get help, and others, for instance, those who have fled Libya into Tunisia. Some of them end up in shelters where you have IOM or UNHCR that can assist them, while others that live in just poor urban areas in Tunisia also more vulnerable in another sense, as they are just taking care of themselves in this lack of legal and national framework.
Do you have, do you have anything to add, Merete, or since you're already in these, maybe working in some of these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think Achlem is right. We are no longer present in Tunisia, unfortunately, but we are present in some of the other countries, and I think access to health is vital to us, and to making sure that it's free and it's accessible for everybody who needs help, and that can be extremely difficult in different countries depending on their legislation, obviously, and also of the services that you can actually provide, like I just say, in terms of safe abortion care and those kinds of legislation that they have towards that. But I would say that even though we are not able to reach, the majority of patients that would have these needs, what we always try to do is to have open doors as much as possible, especially on those areas that cannot be covered by a national health system, for example. But the tricky part is often, and especially for this group, is that people are very afraid to be registered, and they're very afraid that somebody will see them to come to us, and so on and so on. So there are many barriers to overcome, but we do our best to supplement the gaps in care that there would be in a local system.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question, also from Emilie Kronqvist, and I think this is a good question, sort of to sum up today's topic. She asks, do you think the focus on the Ukrainian women fleeing with their children will also increase the opportunity and access to Europe for African migrant women? And I think maybe you should all get the opportunity to say something about this. What do you think? Maybe Signe, you can start.
Thank you, Emilie. As you probably know, that's a very political question. No, I don't think it will give them better opportunities. I think there's a lot to say about the racial dimension and national dimension of the differences that we see now between how Ukrainian women and women from West African countries, for instance, are received. Not only received, but also the discourse, the debate, the narrative, where even though the Ukrainian women are also struggling and suffering, and some are being involved in human trafficking, there's still a whole other narrative that they should come to. For instance, Denmark, they should be protected. They should have special services because they are women, mothers, and the children should have that as well. Then, as we talked about it just in the previous question, African women or refugees from other Middle Eastern countries as well are being talked about as someone who bring the anchor babies, the passport babies, using the children to obtain some kind of humanitarian assistance. And it's not possible to not talk about how race plays part in that, but also, of course, the different kind of political and the political context of the war versus some of the women from West Africa being more considered as migrants looking for work, so labor migrants in opposition to refugees from a war. So no, I don't think it will give them better opportunities. I think it will continues to be two different debates.
Yeah, I see the rest of you nodding. Do you have anything to add, Merete or Achlem? Or?
If I can just say on the health issue alone, I mean, you see a huge difference because I mean, the Ukrainian women coming to Denmark, as soon as they are registered in our system, they also have access to our health system. And you have undocumented migrants in Denmark who does not have access to our system, who has to go through something like Redden International, Vesterbro, and places like that, and rely on the goodwill of doctors and nurses and others who are actually giving them health services outside the system. So there are huge discrepancies between those two groups, and I really don't see that changing until you have the same opportunities for other migrants and refugees undocumented in Denmark as you have for the Ukrainians.
Thank you for that, Merete. And we are, unfortunately out of time, but I don't know. I think maybe if you want, Signe, you can do a little sum up, and because it's you who've been sort of the leader of this research project,
Thank you. I don't have so much to say. I mean, we're running out of time. I just want to say thank you for everyone who attended, and thank you to my wonderful research team, Ahlam Chemlali and Maria Chiara Terrio and Merete for joining. I think we were able to connect some of the issues across borders that women are facing. And I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. And now I can see it says thank you. So I will leave and say bye.